Just like David Draymond's just like a piece of shit, basically.
He's just a little disturbed. This is from the New Metal Agenda. David Draymond co-signs murder of innocents during the visit to Israel. David Draymond of Disturbed has posted pictures of himself signing bombs during a visit with the IDF in Israel this past week.
Let that sink in. If we're feeling diplomatic, we can say that the metal and heavy music community is a diverse coalition of people representing a range of national identities, political affiliations, and influences. As such, there is a plethora of perspectives welcome within. Having said that, as Ozzy put it all the way back at the very birth of our genre, time will tell on their power minds, making war just for fun, treating people just like pawns in chess, wait till their judgment day comes. David Draymond is on the wrong side of metal. While Draymond has been a long-standing Zionist and fervent supporter of Israel and the continued carpet bombing of Palestinians, it also stands in stark contrast to the many anti-war sentiments contained in his own lyrics across his career. Disturbed's 2005 album, 10,000 Fists, critiques the U.S. war machine and the subsequent destabilization of both American families and those abroad. Yet Draymond seems to see zero contradiction between his own writing and the state of Israel's military actions that he vehemently supports in 2024. People in the music community have had an array of opinions and advocacy on the genocide in Gaza, with bands like Enter Shaqiri and Dying Wish successfully boycotting and ousting Barclays, an investment bank that supports Israeli weapons manufacturers, as a sponsor of the popular Download Festival. But few have had the degree of shamelessness to gleefully sign the very bombs being dropped on healthcare workers, civilians, UN representatives, and indeed Israeli hostages. Facing backlash, Draymond has taken to both Instagram and Twitter with this to say in his defense. You think some clueless, willfully ignorant keyboard warriors will change my stance? It's pretty cringe. He sounds like a boomer.
He's a boomer.
He's Gen X, I'm pretty sure. Straight from the Path drummer and host of the popular music podcast, The Downbeat, Craig Reynolds shared a screenshot stating, "Whatever energy a person puts out into the world, be it positive or negative, will be returned to that person 3 times. Following this post, the thick-skinned Draymond immediately blocked Reynolds on social media. Every human rights organization from Amnesty International, UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, to Israel-based organizations such as B'Tselem have categorically condemned the acts of the IDF that have killed at least 40,000 civilians." This is from WPSD Local 6 News. Citizen arrested at Carbondale City Council meeting adopting peace resolution against all wars.
Carbondale police officers arrested citizen Kyle Sullivan at Tuesday's City Council meeting after he continued to speak despite being told to stop. When Sullivan, who is a regular attendee at meetings, approached the podium for public comment, he said he was in favor of the council adopting a peace resolution against all currently occurring wars. Defenders of the war like to claim that the war will end if the hostages are released, ignoring that the Israeli government repeatedly states that they won't end the war even if the hostages are released, he said. Mayor Carolyn Harvey stopped him, and the time clock, which allots 4 minutes to every citizen during public comment, stopped accordingly. Sullivan said he also thinks the wars in Ukraine, Myanmar, and Ethiopia should all end. Councilperson Adam Luce interjected, "Can I suggest that when we're arguing over these points of order, the clock should continue to tick? Otherwise, there's no cost. This attack only happens because the IDF ignored countless warning signs and refused to do the bare minimum," Sullivan said. As he continued to speak, Adam Luce started whispering to Harvey. Harvey then tried to get Sullivan's attention, saying "sir" repeatedly after he continued to speak. She asked officers to remove him. Sullivan continued to speak as officers tried to put his wrists behind his back. One officer said, "You are under arrest," and another officer took Sullivan's phone, which he was reading from, as they both put his wrists in cuffs. "Stop resisting," the first officer said. Sullivan continued to speak as he was removed from the room and then the building. "Once again, common courtesy is expected in these meetings," Harvey said as Sullivan was being removed. "So just let him speak," said Macklin, who spoke in favor of the resolution prior to Sullivan. "If you just let him speak and stop interrupting him." "No, I will not let him speak," Harvey said. "We helped set out guidelines that are particular to this meeting, and that was outside of the guidelines for this meeting." Councilperson Ginger Rice Sanders said that the council had made a decision about the peace resolution against all wars, but it will be delayed for 90 days. "We're working on getting it done," she said. "I do understand where you're coming from, and I hope we can come to some resolution so we can move forward in Carbondale, because there are a lot of things we really need to work on." Councilperson Claire Kilman confirmed that there has been a neutral, compromised, collaborative peace resolution drafted that references no specific conflict and punishes no one. She said every councilperson was given an opportunity for input, and they are currently awaiting legal review that will be the last step.
So he was arrested for speaking for the 4 minutes that every citizen's supposed to get, that he apparently wasn't allowed to have.
Not allowed freedom of speech?
Because he was talking bad about Israel.
He mostly was just like, I want a peace resolution like everywhere.
Why are they doing a peace resolution? They're a city council.
Yeah, I don't know why they get an input.
They don't. It doesn't
They
have.
don't matter.
It doesn't have any bearing on the real world whatsoever. I don't understand. This is from Medical Express. Removal of ovaries before menopause associated with reduced white matter in the brain.
Women who have had their ovaries removed before menopause, particularly before age of 40, have reduced white matter integrity in multiple regions of the brain later in life. White matter refers to the nerve fibers that connect neurons in different areas of the brain. The findings appear in Alzheimer's and dementia. Wait, what?
Alzheimer's and dementia. It's a magazine.
We know that having both ovaries removed before natural menopause causes abrupt endocrine dysfunction, which increases the risk of cognitive impairment and dementia, said Michelle M., professor and chair of epidemiology and prevention at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. But few new neuroimaging studies have been conducted to better understand the underlying mechanisms. For the study, the research team examined data from the Mayo Clinic study of aging to identify women over the age of 50 with available motion tensor imaging and magnetic resonance imaging MRI technique that measures white matter in the brain. Females who had premenopausal bilateral oophorectomy before the age of 40 had significantly reduced white matter integrity in multiple regions of the brain. Having both ovaries removed results in abrupt decrease in both estrogen and testosterone in women, Professor Michelle said additional research is needed to further understand how white matter changes are associated with cognitive impairment. This is from Politico. Dems freak out over Biden's debate performance. Biden is toast, one prominent operative texted. Time for an open convention.
All Joe Biden needed to do was deliver a repeat performance of his State of the Union address. Instead, he stammered, he stumbled, and with fewer than 5 months to November, he played straight into Democrats' worst fears, that he's fumbling away the election to Donald Trump. The alarm bells for Democrats started ringing the second Biden started speaking in a haltingly hoarse voice. Minutes into the debate, he struggled to mount an effective defense of the economy on his watch and flood the description of key health initiatives he's made central to his re-election bid, saying we finally beat Medicare, and incoherently stating how much his administration lowered the price of insulin. He talked himself into a corner on Afghanistan, bringing up his administration's botched withdrawal unprompted. He repeatedly mixed up billion and million, and he found himself stuck for long stretches of the 90-minute debate playing defense. And when he wasn't speaking, he stood frozen behind his podium, mouth agape, his eyes wide and unblinking for long stretches of time. Biden is toast, calling it now, an attorney and Democratic activist from New Hampshire who co-chaired former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley's 2016 presidential campaign in the state. In text messages with Politico, Democrats expressed confusion and concern as they watched the first minutes of the event. One former Biden White House campaign aide called it terrible, adding that they had to ask themselves over and over, what did he just say? This is crazy. Politico spoke to about a dozen Democrats, some of whom were granted anonymity to discuss Biden's performance. Biden's team was quick to defend the president's performance. First, they said he had a cold, and he was negative for COVID. Then they insisted Trump was hurting himself by insulting Biden's presidential record. Biden did grow stronger throughout the night, at one point seizing on Trump's reported dismissal of fallen soldiers as suckers and losers, to skewer the former president as a real sucker and loser. At others, he hammered Trump's criminal conviction in New York. The only person on the stage who's a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now, Biden said. But first impressions matter, particularly to voters just tuning into the election and who are more likely to watch the first debate than the second that's scheduled for September. And instead of setting the tone for the next phase of the presidential campaign, Biden's shaky performance reignited fears among Democrats that the octogenarian, whose mental acuity and physical fitness have stood as voters' chief concerns, about returning him to the White House might not even be able to carry the party through to November. Time for an open convention, one prominent operative texted. Biden's team had tried to engineer the debate in his favor, pushing for it to be early and without an audience, and the president agreed to hold the event in part to calm Democratic nerves over whether he could win in November. Already, some Democrats were openly saying that Biden should end his campaign. One major Democratic donor and Biden supporter said simply, Biden needs to drop out, no question about it. Biden struggled at times to articulate strong arguments on some of his campaign's biggest selling points, bungling his healthcare record and stumbling through a response on his support for abortion rights. That's weird. His healthcare record, like how he promised us a public option and never did it, and a response on his support for abortion rights. You mean that he didn't codify Roe v. Wade, and he's talking about doing it now, even though he's the president right now? I support Roe v. Wade. You have 3 trimesters. First time is between a woman and a doctor. Second time is between a doctor and an extreme situation. Third time is between the doctor, between the woman and the state, he said. Trump tripped too. He called former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's daughter a documentary filmmaker, a Philly maker. He accused Democrats of wanting to take the life of a child after birth. He inflated the country's economic strength under his presidency.
I really did like his after birth scenario.
Yeah, just straight up infanticide. His country's economic strength under his presidency.
All the scholars agree. It was the best. Oh my god, he did that so many times.
I have the best economy. I was the best president.
And you were the worst of all time.
Biden is a bad president. He's the worst president. Just read the fucking transcript of this. He reiterated his defense of the January 6th insurrectionists, launching into a lengthy diatribe against the convictions of hundreds of Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol in an effort to overturn the 2020 election, and asked repeatedly if he would accept the results of the election no matter the winner. Trump refused to give a straight answer, eventually specifying that he'd only do so if the election is fair and free.
Correction. He determines it's fair.
He's already said if he doesn't win, it's rigged. So.
Yeah, well, January 6th time too.
But Trump largely did what Republicans had begged him to do. Show some restraint while also laying bare Biden's weaknesses. The former president, who delights in calling Biden sleepy and crooked at every turn, waited a full 20 minutes to draw attention to the Democrats' initially shaky performance. I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence, Trump said, after Biden stuttered through an answer to a question about immigration. I don't think he knows what he just said either. And in a relatively staid debate, it was Biden who fell short of even the lowest expectations. After the debate, Cullen said, anyone who has watched a parent grow old, frail, and foggy recognizes what they are seeing and knows it only gets worse.
This is from the New York Times. A dark day for Democrats. The combination of President Biden's debate performance and adverse Supreme Court rulings left Democrats reeling in despair, with elections not far off.
Democrats confronted a nightmare scenario on Friday as they surveyed the wreckage of major political, policy, and legal disasters piled atop one another with elections for control of the White House and Congress less than 5 months away. Even as they reeled from President Biden's poor performance on Thursday night in a make-or-break debate with former President Donald J. Trump, Democrats were slammed anew Friday by the Supreme Court. In one far-reaching ruling, the court undercut the government's long-standing power to regulate health care, public safety, and the environment, a core tenet of the Democratic orthodoxy. In another, the justices handed down a decision that could make it more difficult to prosecute those who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, and potentially Mr. Trump himself for the roles in the violent insurrection. And I think it was something to do with presidential immunity. But I'm really worried about this one, the standing power to regulate healthcare and stuff. Does that mean that Medicare and Medicaid are now unconstitutional? Or is the EPA unconstitutional now?
Well, if they no longer have the power to regulate healthcare, public safety, does that mean that there's no longer an opioid crisis and doctors and pharmacies are no longer going to be contractually obligated when somebody ODs?
Are we defunding the police?
Well, that is safety. That is public safety. Yeah, I don't like the regulation on the medicine because that can also open up being like no FDA regulation. So you can take a vitamin which is not regulated by the FDA, which means they don't have to list everything that they actually put in it on the bottle. With the FDA approved medications, you have to list every single ingredient. So if people are allergic, have any kind of adverse reactions, they can narrow it down specifically, but like nonetheless, does that mean they're not going to regulate any of that now? Is there no longer going to be refill too soon on controlled substances? Is there no longer going to be like state mandated controlled substance checking internet programs? I'm not sure what they're called everywhere.
They get rid of the whole drug scheduling system if you want to get the federal government out of public safety.
Which also means that you just took all the C1s and made them completely legal? I think we need some more specifications from those fucking idiots.
Yeah.
But remember, these are also some of the dumbasses that thought you could take a fallopian tube pregnancy and reimplant it into the uterus. Just remember how stupid these fucking people are.
It was a day that encapsulated the party's worst fears about the coming elections and the rightward tilt of the Supreme Court. And it drove home how Republicans and Mr. Trump are within reach of victory in November, putting them in a position to achieve a host of policy objectives vehemently opposed by Democrats, even with a presumptive nominee who is a convicted felon and a party that has been in deep disarray and shown little ability to govern. It is a bad day for democracy and a threatening day for the rule of law, said Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut and senior member of the Judiciary Committee. Mr. Biden's halting performance prompted a frenzy of speculation about whether he should or even could be replaced as the nominee, a possibility that many leading Democrats dismissed. But the Supreme Court rulings hit just as hard, underscoring the stakes of the coming election and how the impact of Mr. Trump's first term in office is still being felt profoundly. The decisions struck at the heart of Democrats' view of government, one where those who turn to violence to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power should be punished, and one where federal agencies must have the power to interpret federal law and protect the public from corporate misbehavior. Adding insult to injury, the rulings came at a time when Democrats firmly believe the court has been compromised because of the ties of some conservative justices to billionaire businessmen, as well as their tacit support of the January 6th movement. As far as Democrats are concerned, that bias was exposed by the flying of a flag sympathetic to January 6 rioters at the Virginia home of Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. Both Justice Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife Virginia was involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election, refused to recuse themselves from the case. Despite the ground seemingly shifting beneath them, Democrats saw one potential benefit: the possibility that voters worried about empowered Republicans in the direction of the Supreme Court could be motivated to vote for Mr. Biden, particularly with the prospect that the next president will have new vacancies to fill on the court. If people are really paying attention here, said Mr. Blumenthal, alarm bells should be going off at kitchen tables around the country. This is from Live Science. NASA offers SpaceX $843 million to destroy the International Space Station. The International Space Station is nearing the end of its operational life. Now NASA is developing a plan for SpaceX to destroy it.
NASA is preparing to destroy the International Space Station, or ISS, awarding SpaceX an up to $843 million contract to push the station safely out of orbit and back to Earth. According to the space agency's plans, SpaceX's specially designed deorbit vehicle will drag the football field-sized ISS back to Earth sometime after the end of its operational life in 2030. The ISS will smash into our planet's atmosphere at the speed of more than 17,000 miles per hour, or 27,500 kilometers per hour, before landing in a crash-down spot in the ocean. The floating laboratory's first parts were launched in 1998, and it has been occupied by astronauts from the US, Japan, Russia, Canada, and Europe since 2000, who have completed more than 3,300 scientific experiments in a close orbit above Earth. But the space station is showing its age. Technical faults and leaks continue to cause issues for crews, and the contracts between the 5 participating national space agencies, which marked an era of global cooperation in space following the end of the Cold War, will end by 2030. The ISS also faces risks from the growing problem of space junk, orbital debris made of other defect satellites whipping around Earth at high speeds. On Thursday, June 27th, 9 astronauts aboard the ISS were forced to take shelter in the docked Boeing Starliner crew capsule after hundreds of pieces of debris from a shattered Russian satellite threatened the space station's safety. The crew were allowed to return to the ISS after about an hour, and operations continued as normal. When the ISS is ready to be destroyed, it is also unclear how much other space agencies will shoulder the burden. NASA said in its statement that the safe deorbit of the International Space Station is the responsibility of all 5 space agencies, but the extent of their financial or technical involvement in SpaceX's drag and dump is unspecified. The ISS's fiery descent won't be the first performed by a decommissioned space station. In 2001, Russia's Mir space station was sent plummeting back to Earth, and its surviving fragments were swallowed by the Pacific Ocean.
This is from Business Insider. Elon Musk calls out Boeing's historic first crewed spaceflight, saying SpaceX beat them to the punch years ago.
Elon Musk soured the day of Boeing's first astronaut flight to space by lobbing criticism at the company on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. Boeing built the Starliner spaceship in collaboration with NASA, and it's set to launch into space on Monday evening, carrying astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams to the International Space Station. Not only did SpaceX do it faster, its spaceship was also cheaper, costing NASA just $2.6 billion. Since its first crewed flight in 2020, the company has flown 7 astronaut crews to and from the ISS for NASA, with its eighth currently living on the station. It has also flown 4 private missions. With each flight, SpaceX has earned money while Boeing has been sinking more and more funds into Starliner. There were clear technical reasons for the delays. During Starliner's first attempt to fly to the ISS without a crew, software errors forced it to return to Earth early. Then, a series of issues, including dysfunctional valve in the propulsion system, caused further delays. Boeing was used to the government paying all of its expenses to deliver the best possible product. Under that model, Berger explained, cost overruns and delays were not the company's problem. They were NASA's. Suddenly, with a fixed price, it's up to the company to figure out what risks to take in terms of new technologies and new approaches, said Neild, who was a former associate administrator of the FAA's Office in the Commercial Space Transportation.
This is from the New York Post. NASA assures that Boeing Starliner astronauts are not stranded on the International Space Station.
That was so funny.
I think you the whole title?
No. The title was Boeing Starliner astronauts are not stranded on the International Space Station while being stranded on the International Space Station. It's like Trump going out there like, hey, they're not stranded. They're perfectly safe.
They're up there flushing toilets 40 times.
NASA officials said that despite an infinite delay in their return to Earth, the Boeing Starliner crew stuck at the International Space Station due to a mechanical issue with their spacecraft are not stranded in space. Starliner commander Butch Wilmore and co-pilot Sunita Williams have been confined to the space station for weeks after their June 5th launch on Boeing's first manned spaceflight. They were due to return on June 13th at the station.
Station.
Sorry, yeah. It's a station. Space station. Why didn't they call it that? They should have called it the station. Okay. They were due to return on June 13th after a week at the station, but the craft suffered issues with its thrusters and helium leaks when docking at the station, keeping them in orbit indefinitely as engineers analyzed the problems. So essentially, it's complete the testing, complete the fault tree, bring that analysis into the mission management team, and then have an agency-level review, and then we'll lay out the rest of the plan from undocked to landing. I think we're on a good path. The return model of the Starliner spacecraft is docked to the ISS's Harmony module, but Harmony has limited fuel, narrowing the window for a return date. Yeah, it only has like 45 days of fuel. 45 days of fuel, and it's been up there since June 5th. Hey, NASA.
Houston, we have a problem.
Yeah. Boeing's service model, which houses the helium lines, thrusters, and other critical systems, is discarded before re-entry and burns up in the atmosphere. Engineers want to study the failed systems and hardware before it's destroyed and collect as much data as possible before the astronauts return home. So basically, hey, you guys are stuck in space, but will you just stay stuck up there? Because we want to know what happened. The Starliner launched with one known helium leak, but 4 others developed as the craft tried to dock. At the station, valves are closed to cut off the helium system, avoiding any additional leakage. When they depart, however, the valves must be reopened to repressurize the lines. Even with the known leaks, the capsule still has 10 times the amount of helium it needs to get home, but engineers want to ensure that the leaks won't worsen once the system is pressurized, according to Stitch. Oh, yeah, Stitch knows.
Stitch.
Yeah, he knows. He had a spaceship that went to. I don't think he docked with anybody, but
Stitch knows space. knows spaceships.
Let's trust the blue space dog. The 5 thrusters in the Starliner service module also failed to operate as expected during approach to the space station on June 6th, but are ready to operate for departure. Beginning next week, a new identical thruster will be test-fired at NASA's facility in New Mexico to determine what may have gone wrong. The ground tests are expected to last a couple of weeks. Boeing has been plagued by a series of problems over the past few years. In January, a fuselage plug blew off a new Alaskan airline Boeing 737 MAX 9 at 10,000 feet. Their 737 MAX planes also suffered crashes in 2018 and 2019. So an update on the Alaskan Airlines. Apparently what Boeing is coming at, they found an employee to throw under the bus, basically. So they're like, hey, because this guy didn't fill out paperwork correctly, that's why all this happened. No, it's because the plane didn't get put together correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Not that the fucking paperwork didn't get filled out, you stupid fucking cunt.
Right.
This is from The Intercept. Like
Assange,
I know how it feels to be prosecuted for acts of journalism. The most dangerous precedent in the case against Assange is the idea that the U.S. government can decide how to define journalism.
When Julian Assange abruptly found himself back in Australia this week after reaching a plea deal with the U.S. government, I found myself thinking back to my own marathon legal fight with the U.S. government and how it finally and suddenly ended. I waged a 7-year legal battle against the George W. Bush administration and later the Obama administration, both of which demanded I reveal the confident sources I had relied on for a story I wrote about a botched CIA operation. I wrote about the CIA operation for the New York Times, but the paper's editors suppressed the story at the government's request. I published it in my 2006 book, State of War. The government then launched a leak investigation, subpoenaing me in 2008 to try to force me to testify and reveal my sources. The government threatened that if I didn't comply, I could be thrown in prison for contempt of court. I refused and fought them all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2015, as negative publicity mounted on the Obama administration for his campaign to put a reporter in prison, I was called to attend a court hearing. When the prosecutor asked me whether I would go to prison rather than reveal my sources, I said yes. This time the government backed down, abandoning its efforts to force me to testify. At the end of the hearing, I drove home and had a glass of champagne with my wife to celebrate. I felt free for the first time in 7 years. My personal experience has made me sympathize with Assange, even as so many other Americans have turned on him. My legal fight left me exhausted both mentally and physically, especially during the long periods when my case was being ignored by the press and the outside world. I learned firsthand that the Justice Department's primary legal strategy in such cases is to try to bankrupt people and wear them down so they cut deals rather than go to trial. I emerged victorious when my case finally ended. I never revealed my sources, but the result of facing down the government for so long made me far more suspicious of power and less willing to accept authority. I'm sure that as Assange returns to Australia to try to put his life back together, he will recognize that he has changed in surprising ways as well. To be sure, there are stark differences between Assange's experiences and my own. Assange was a polarizing figure long before he faced prosecution with enemies on both sides of the American political divide. Republicans hated him for what he did in 2010, when he published classified documents from the Pentagon and the State Department on his WikiLeaks website, while also sharing those documents with mainstream news organizations like The Guardian and the New York Times. Those documents led to a wide range of disclosures about the dark and abusive actions of the United States in the post-9/11 era, from Iraq to Afghanistan and beyond in the global war on terror. Democrats, meanwhile, learned to hate Assange for what he did in 2016. Knowingly or not, he served as a go-between for Russian intelligence. Moscow hacked the emails of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and the Democratic Party and then turned them over to Assange, who published the emails and related Democratic Party documents on WikiLeaks, while also doling them out to reporters from mainstream news organizations during the 2016 presidential campaign, damaging the Clinton campaign and helping Donald Trump. Now, after years in prison in Britain while fighting extradition to the United States, Assange has finally cut a deal with the Justice Department. He pleaded guilty this week to violating the Espionage Act and in return was released from prison for the time he has served in Britain. Many of his supporters have declared this a victory for Assange, but by obtaining a guilty plea, the Justice Department can also claim victory and ominously the same tactics to go after other reporters. Assange's unpopularity means that few have viewed him as a martyr in the case of press freedom, but he is a victim of an abusive prosecution by a government seeking to silence whistleblowers, and his case has set a dangerous precedent that could severely damage press freedom in the United States. Though his legal saga has come to an end, the role he has played in journalism has never been fully resolved or even accurately defined. Assange was a strange hybrid figure in journalism. WikiLeaks, the online organization he co-founded, obtained documents from sources inside governments and other organizations and then made them public, either by publishing them on his own website or by sharing them on major news organizations. Journalists learned to cultivate relationships with Assange in order to get their hands on secret documents that WikiLeaks had obtained from whistleblowers. Did that make Assange a go-between, a source, a journalist, and all three rolled into one? The Justice Department arbitrarily sought to decide itself how to define Assange's role by declaring that Assange did not act as a legitimate journalist when he interacted with Chelsea Manning, the former Army analyst and whistleblower who leaked the classified State Department and U.S. military documents to Assange. The notion that the U.S. government gets to decide how to define journalism might prove to be the least understood and most dangerous precedent set by the long and messy case against Assange.
This is from Crikey. Assange should be welcomed home as a hero who exposed imperialism's grisly workings. The WikiLeaks founder briefly offered a world in which power's operations were exposed to sunlight. It didn't last, but his achievements are historic.
It's wonderful that after 14 years, including 5 years in a high-security prison, Assange will be free and can start recuperating, if not recovering from his persecution. But the damage to journalism, to transparency, to the task of speaking truth to power is done. He has had to plead guilty to a charge of conspiracy under the U.S. Espionage Act. There is now an established precedent for journalists, editors, and publishers, even those outside the United States, to be persecuted if they embarrass the U.S. government by revealing classified information. And even if Assange had rejected the deal and stayed to fight on in the UK and won his appeal, much of that damage would still be done. It was done during the long years he hid from the U.S. reach in Ecuador's London embassy. It was done in the speed with which the Trump administration unveiled charges against Assange the moment he was dragged out of the embassy. Via the Afghan war diary. Via the Afghan war diary. Via the...
Diarrhea.
It was done in 5 long years in Belmarsh prison. It was exemplary punishment for a man who had exposed the real workings of the U.S. Damn it. It was done in 5 long years in Belmarsh prison. It was exemplary punishment for a man who had exposed... Damn it.
You can't even get close.
Stop. That's my goal.
The diarrhea of Jane.
Serious. It was done in 5 long years in Belmarsh prison. It was exemplary punishment for a man who had exposed
Exploded diarrhea.
Exposed. We can do this. I'm just tired.
Hey, I said spations.
It was done in 5 long years in Belmarsh prison. It was exemplary punishment for a man who had exposed the real workings of the U.S. imperialist apparatus via those cables, via the Afghan war diary, via the shocking collateral murder video of a war crime by U.S. personnel in Iraq. Like Daniel Ellsberg in the early 1970s, and like Edward Snowden in 2013, WikiLeaks offered a historic glimpse of how power really worked, how the U.S. systematically abused people held at Guantanamo Bay, how U.S. diplomacy was routinely used in the service of large corporations, how the U.S. Army engaged in atrocities in its war on terror campaigns. The corporate media, which purports to hold the powerful to account, never really forgave Assange, even as it scrambled to work with him to access the material he had. Even now, the resentment toward Assange is now is on display from outlets who see their role as propping up, not exposing power. The remarkable material released by Snowden seemed to confirm that a new era was upon us. Instead, the window of transparency shut, at least on governments, which rapidly armed themselves with draconian powers to go after whistleblowers. The flood of information became a dribble. The big caches of data became hacked personal information up for sale on the dark web, not details of how imperialist governments operated. Assange briefly gave us hope that the secrecy with which governments cloaked their sordid actions could be thrown back and the operations of power exposed to sunlight. It was this, more than anything, that drove the U.S. to pursue him for so long. It's why so many handmaidens to the powerful continue to resent him and WikiLeaks. Whatever you may think of this complicated man, he should be welcomed back home as the hero of an age that was far too short but gave us so much. Diary of Jane.
A good song?
Say it with your motherfucking chest. That's part of a song. What?
This is from Politico. U.S. and Europe warn Hezbollah to ease strikes on Israel and back off from wider Mid-East war. Iran and Israel traded threats of what Iran said would be an obliterating war over Hezbollah. We need more sleep.
U.S., European, and Arab mediators are pressing to keep stepped up cross-border attacks between Israel and Lebanon. Iran-backed Hezbollah militants from spiraling into a wider Middle East war that the world has feared for months.
Yeah, it's all really hard to say.
Can these fucking journalists get in? Hopes are lagging for a ceasefire in Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza that would calm attacks by Hezbollah and other Iranian-allied militias. With the stalled talks in mind, American and European diplomats and other officials are delivering warnings to Hezbollah, which is far stronger than Hamas but seen as overconfident, about taking on the military might of Israel, current and former diplomats say. The might of Israel? You mean they cry to America to do everything for them? The Americans and Europeans are warning the group it should not count on the United States or anyone else being able to hold off Israeli leaders if they decide to execute battle-ready plans for an offensive into Lebanon, and Hezbollah should not count on its fighters' ability to handle whatever would come next. On both sides of the Lebanese border, escalating strikes between Israel and Hezbollah, one of the region's best armed fighting forces, appeared at least to level off this week. While daily strikes still pound the border area, the slight shift offered hope of easing immediate fears, which had prompted the U.S. to send an amphibious assault ship with a Marine expeditionary force to join other warships in the area in hopes of deterring a wider conflict. Why are we always trying to stick our dick in crazy?
Yeah, so we're like, hey guys, we're going to try to make sure we keep peace, but we're going to send our war assault ships over.
Yeah, don't
and
you see
assault ship is not a peace.
Yeah. You see the aircraft carrier? That's a white flag. That's a...
You see the bomb that
it's an olive branch, bro.
Do you see that bomb? We painted a white flag on it and then signed it.
Despite this past week's plateauing of hostilities, said Gerald Furstein, a former senior U.S. diplomat in the Middle East, it certainly seems that Israelis are still arranging themselves in the expectation that there will be some kind of conflict, an entirely different magnitude of conflict. This message being delivered to Hezbollah is, don't think that you're capable as you think you are, he said. I think Israel's overconfident. They're going to start shit in the south, start shit in the north, and ask for daddy to come save them. Beginning the day after Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel triggered the war in Gaza, Hezbollah has launched rockets into northern Israel and vowed to continue until a ceasefire takes hold. Israel has hit back with the violence, forcing tens of thousands of civilians from the border in both countries. Attacks intensified this month after Israel killed a top Hezbollah commander, and Hezbollah responded with some of its biggest missile barrages. UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths used the word apocalyptic to describe a war that could result. Both Israel and Hezbollah, the dominant force in politically fractured Lebanon, have the power to cause heavy casualties. Such a war would be a catastrophe for Lebanon, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said as he met recently with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant at the Pentagon. Another war between Israel and Hezbollah could easily become a regional war with terrible consequences for the Middle East. Gallant, in response, said, "We are working closely together to achieve an agreement, but we must also discuss readiness on every possible scenario. Analysts expect other Iran-allied militias in the region would respond far more forcefully than they have for Hamas, and some experts warn of ideologically motivated militants streaming into the region to join in. Europeans fear destabilizing refugee flows." And if it looks like any Israeli offensive in Lebanon is going seriously south for the Israelis, the U.S. will intervene. I don't think that they would. I don't think that they would see any alternative to that. While Iran, which is preoccupied with a political transition at home, shows no signs of wanting a war now, it sees Hezbollah as a strategically vital partner in the region, much more so than Hamas, and could be drawn in. Upping tensions, Iran's UN mission said in a posting Saturday on X that an obliterating war would ensue if Israel launches a full-scale attack in Lebanon. Israeli Foreign Minister Katz responded by pledging his country would move against Hezbollah with full force unless it stopped attacks. While the U.S. helped Israel knock down a barrage of Iranian missiles and drones in April, the U.S. likely would not do as well assisting Israel's defense against any broader Hezbollah attacks, said General C.Q. Brown, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It is harder to fend off the shorter-range rockets that Hezbollah fires routinely across the border, he said. The Israeli army is stretched after a nearly 9-month war in Gaza, and Hezbollah holds an estimated arsenal of some 150,000 rockets and missiles capable of striking anywhere in Israel. Israeli leaders, meanwhile, have pledged to unleash Gaza-like scenes of devastation in Lebanon if a full-blown war erupts. You know, bomb them like pussies, carpet bomb babies. White House officials have blamed Hezbollah for escalating tensions and said it backs Israel's right to defend itself. The Biden administration also has told the Israelis that opening a second front is not in their interest. That was a point hammered home to Gallant during his latest talks in Washington with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Austin, CIA Director William Burns, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, among others. We are going to continue to help Israel defend itself. That's not going to change, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said. But as for a hypothetical, especially with respect to the northern borderline, again, we want to see no second front open, and we want to see if we can't resolve the tensions out there through diplomatic processes. White House officials, however, are not discounting the real possibility that a second front in the Mid-East conflict could open. In conversations with Israeli and Lebanese officials and other regional stakeholders, there is an agreement that a major escalation is not in anybody's interest, a senior Biden administration official said. The official, who is not authorized to comment publicly about White House deliberations and spoke on condition of anonymity, bristled at the purported logic of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, arguing that Israel would see an end to Hezbollah attacks by reaching a ceasefire agreement with Hamas in Gaza. But the official also acknowledged that the elusive ceasefire deal in Gaza would also go a long way in quieting tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border.
One is this right here. Them being like to Hezbollah, don't think that you're as capable as you think you are. Like, that's just some
like
weak ass shit.
Schoolyard cringe, dude.
And so is, if you mess with me, I'll do to you like I did to Gaza.
You know what I did? Do you know what I did? I killed your babies.
The next thing I wanted to point out was them saying this right here. Beginning the day after Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel triggered the war in Gaza.
No, that sucked. No.
Yeah, the word that I seen that too, and I was just like, oh no, I need to point that out. That
the genocide started in 1948.
Yeah.
When the occupation started in 1967, the official one anyway.
The more we've been learning on it and stuff, I've seen those two things, and I wanted to point that.
So we can't wait to do more war crimes.
If you're going to be the school bully, if somebody stands up to you that's just as big or bigger than you are, you can't go running home to daddy. You take care of yourself.
Though. That's exactly what they're gonna do.
I know. And then they're gonna cry and be like, they started it and Cartman. A Cartman.
Yeah, literally, Israel is literally Cartman.
Yes.
This is from Aeon. In the interests of all, how Eugene Debs turned American republicanism against the chiefs of capitalism and became a true crusader for freedom.
A shot rang out from the jailhouse at Woodstock, Illinois on a quiet summer's morning in 1895. One of the inmates had pulled the trigger on an old Civil War musket after thrusting it between the iron bars of a window. The gun was fired by the Union leader Eugene V. Debs to mark the 4th of July. This was no prison break, but a demand for another kind of freedom. Later that day, he would write in praise of liberty while delivering the grim verdict that in the United States, it now lies cold, stiff, and dead. Soon to be the country's most influential socialist, how had Debs come to find himself contemplating the prospects of U.S. liberty from behind the bars of McHenry County Jail? But it must be admitted that the man himself cut a striking figure, being possessed of great charisma, courage, and powers of speech, his French immigrant parents found their way from Alsace to Indiana, where little Jean was born in 1855. Something of the frontier spirit still survived in the small city, which had not yet suffered the sharp class divisions that were visible elsewhere in the country. Although Debs left school at 14, heading to the railroad to scrape paint and grease for 50 cents a day, his education acquainted him with the Republican history of the U.S., which held the liberty and sovereignty of its citizens in its highest regard. Graduating from the paint shop to a job as a locomotive fireman, his mother pleaded with Debs to quit the railroads after an accident killed 2 of his colleagues. An abysmal safety record and negligible compensation for injured railwaymen were just some of the ruthless business practices of crooked industrialists. Before wisely heeding his mother's warnings, Debs joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, subsequently rising to become his grad secretary and editing the widely read Fireman's Magazine for well over a decade. His new prominence would even lead to his election as a Democratic member of the Indiana House of Representatives in the mid-1880s. But sensing the limitations of both the state legislator and the conservative craft unionism of the Brotherhood, he sought a different vehicle to advance the interests of railroad workers.
What began to disturb Debs was the despotic power of corporations and the judicially sanctioned violence that could be unleashed on workers who resisted attempts to sack them or suppress their wages. As he later remarked, their combined influence let loose deputy marshals armed with pistols and clubs and supported by troops with gleaming bayonets and shotted guns, and has vanished liberty from the land.
He came to feel that citizens could no longer be counted as free when they were under the thumb of a plutocratic ruling class backed by a corrupt judiciary and the violence of hired Pinkerton strikebreakers, with helpless workers even coming to resemble slaves. Leading the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in the failed Burlington Railroad strike of 1888, where several workers were killed, brought home to Debs the bitter limits of this kind of organizing. So he gradually broke with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in order to help found the American Railway Union in 1893, which aimed to unite all those who worked on the railroads, while enjoying rapid growth ahead of an early victory on the Great Northern Railroad. This set the scene for the Pullman strike that would propel Debs to national fame and put him on a collision course with the powerful economic, legal, and political elites. George Mortimer Pullman was an industrial magnate who manufactured railroad sleeper carriages from his company town of Pullman on the outskirts of Chicago. He set the rents of the houses in which his workers were required to live and imposed a strict moral code on them, including discouraging alcohol and gambling. When a nationwide financial panic hit in 1893, Pullman made dramatic cuts in wages while maintaining rents at their existing levels. Workers were squeezed dry, and they braced themselves for a desperate fight for survival. The ensuing conflict drew in the American Railway Union, which eventually called a boycott of trains that continued to carry Pullman carriages. The leaders of the American Railway Union, including Debs, did not stand down. Their fate was sealed by the Supreme Court upholding an earlier decision to jail them for contempt of court. What mostly outraged Debs and his fellow defendants was that no jury had convicted them of a crime. They had been incarcerated at an autocratic whim of a federal judge with no opportunity to plead their case in front of ordinary citizens. If Debs could be locked up so easily, he reasoned that his fellow citizens were unfree too. But the courts were not the only arbitrary authority that must be fought in order to be free. The federal government responded by obtaining an injunction to stop strikers interfering with railways, and specifically the free traffic of mail cars. The rise of industrial capitalism in the closing decade of the 19th century created a breeding ground for unaccountable power. Wage workers, in particular, were at the mercy of their wealthy employers, who determined whether they would earn enough to house, clothe, and feed themselves and their families. Without the safety net of a welfare state, the discretion to dispense the laborers effectively gave wealthy industrialists the power to impoverish workers who demanded better conditions or were simply deemed surplus to requirements. The huge fortunes of industrial millionaires also granted sweeping political influence, whether through outright bribes or more subtle webs of influence. And In mounting these criticisms, Deb took himself to be following in the footsteps of a long-standing Republican tradition in the U.S., which lauded the freedom of its citizens. Yet his own path through the labor struggles of the Gilded Age would lead Debs to a more radical destination than his Republican forebears. He demanded an unequivocally socialist republic in which all could be free.
Debs turned the resonant language of Republican political thought against bosses in the whole system that sustained their power. Like Republicans of old, he warned of a fatal dependence on the arbitrary will of others, but rather than attacking the untrammeled authority of a king or overseas legislator, he adapted this analysis to the conditions of a rapidly industrializing capitalist economy. There could be no political equality when workers were dependent on capitalists who owned the resources, tools, and machines needed to make a living. Debs would conclude that no man is free in any just sense who has to rely upon the arbitrary will of another for the opportunity to work. But that unfreedom was the reality for most working people who labored and therefore lived by the permission of bosses. Control became key to how Debs understood work under capitalism. The long hours, unsafe conditions, and exhausting nature of much of this labor was not lost on him.
As a former locomotive fireman, shoveling coal into a firebox of a rail engine, Debs knew what grueling work meant. Nor did he have any illusions about the bleak conditions among the mills, factories, mines, and farms, where day after day, workers slogged their guts out for a meager reward. But Debs' complaint was more fundamental than poor working conditions or even low wages. It took aim at the lack of freedom at the heart of the economy. If freedom was the destination, the solution to such vulnerability could not be nicer bosses. This conviction led Debs to a socialism that sought to secure economic freedom for all. Finding himself in another courtroom towards the end of his life, he set out this socialist demand. All things that are jointly needed and used ought to be jointly owned. That industry, the basis of our social life, instead of being the private property of a few and operated for their enrichment, ought to be the common property of all, democratically administered in the interest of all. That conclusion was not the product of the giddy enthusiasm of youth or a life of detached scholarly study. It was wrestled from a tireless struggle in support of workers being chewed up and spat out by a capitalist economy and the plutocrats who it enriched.
Debs' time in McHenry County Jail was a point of inflection in the development of his political thought, confronting the combined power of industrialists, the government, and the judiciary while ending up in prison for his troubles led Debs to think more seriously about what kind of society would allow people to be free. That his answer was socialism might surprise us. Perhaps a socialist society would be more equal, perhaps even more just, but why think it would be freer? Won't the clunking fist of the state actively deprive people of their liberty by appropriating their property and pushing them around? While freedom born of control over property remains central to this Republican story, this is no longer private property. Instead, economic freedom can result only from collective ownership. A real republic, according to Debs, cannot restrict democracy to narrowly political affairs, but must be founded on an economic democracy.
Under such a system, working life would be geared not to profit, but to human needs, nor would anything of great value be lost, since we no more need owners of the railroads and other great machines than we need a king. This was the ethos that informed the Socialist Party of America and its forerunner, the Social Democratic Party of America, which Debs helped found in 1901. He was their U.S. presidential candidate 5 times and secured 6% of the national vote in 1912. This turn to electoral politics was not only motivated by the opportunities for propaganda afforded by electoral campaigns, but the realization that political office was needed to definitively transform the country. Yet, this did not imply a rejection of the union activity to which Debs had devoted much of his life. Just as he had turned from craft unions segregated by job type to the industry-wide American Railway Union, Debs came to embrace an even more capacious model of industrial unionism that sought to bring together the whole working class. Thus, along with many of the most influential members of the U.S. labor movement, Debs contributed to the creation of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905. They were committed to abolishing They were committed to abolishing waged labor and ultimately sought to construct a new society within the shell of the old. His speeches were legendary, with working people being left in no doubt that he would always fight alongside them. But he hated demagoguery and would often stress the importance of self-education and following one's own conscience. I am no labor leader. I don't want you to follow me or anyone else. If you are looking for a Moses to lead you out of this capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I would not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out. You must use your heads as well as your hands and get yourself out of your present condition.
This is a socialism from below. Fatherly leaders directing the class struggle with their superior foresight were not what was needed. The working class must instead free itself, while drawing its strength from the democratic energies of workers and citizens as a whole. The most iconic Debs quote, "While there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." It was this sincere identification with the oppressed that won Debs such a hearing throughout his political career. Indeed, he would get close to 1 million votes as presidential candidate in 1920, while still a prisoner and unable to conduct rallies or give speeches.
His victorious opponent in the contest, Warren G. Harding, eventually commuted his sentence to time served, with Debs being released on Christmas Day in 1921 after spending more than 2.5 years inside. This was not the first time Debs had been imprisoned, but this longer and more onerous stay led him to reflect at greater length on the conditions of prisoners and the place of criminality within a socialist society. The main function of law, he believed, was to keep the poor in subjection to the ruling class, and most prisoners owed their sentences to the poverty thrust upon them by the demands of a capitalist economy. In an early statement of what we would now call prison abolitionism, Debs held that prisons in anything like their current form would and should be eliminated by a socialism that stood for human liberty. Theft, in particular, would dwindle when the economic subordination created by capitalism was replaced by cooperative production and common ownership. Other crimes that remained ought to be handled by civilized institutions rather than through the brutality of prison life. Debs' often frayed health had suffered from incarceration and did not hold for long after his release. Slowed by cardiovascular problems, he died less than 5 years later at the age of 70 in 1926. But he left a vivid legacy, not only in a life that has inspired later U.S. socialists such as Bernie Sanders, but intellectual, if unscholarly, contribution to Republican and socialist thought. The promise of liberty, of free citizens not subject to the whims of bosses, judges, and plutocratic class was not to be found in the anarchy of market competition. Instead, it required us all to have a democratic say in how the economy is governed, and the workplaces where we spend so much of our lives. That vision asks people to break with the desperate attachment to private property that has become second nature to so many of us. True security and the liberty-giving independence of thought and action that it brings rests upon a deeper act of solidarity where we learn to cooperate in our economic lives rather than dance to the tune of profit. Debs held that the path to freedom runs through the institutions of a socialist republic.